Hello everyone, welcome back to my studio. Today we're painting this beautiful sunrise with birds on the telephone wire. I'm a bit under the weather, so I apologize ahead of time if I sound like it. To start off, we are painting our 5" by 7" watercolor paper with just water, and I'm using an oval wash brush, making sure that every little bit of it is very wet. You don't want large puddles. You don't want puddles on your paper, but you do want it all to be very shiny so you can tell that it is very wet. What I'm doing with the brush now is getting areas that did puddle and brushing that extra water off on the paper towel. And now we're going in to the cadmium lemon yellow, or cadmium lemon, mine is called. And it's just the lightest yellow that came with this set. You can use any yellow that you have. It does not need to be the cadmium lemon color. I have heard of some artists avoiding cadmium yellows because of the cadmium possibly being toxic. I don't know a lot about that yet. I haven't really looked into it. But if you have a yellow that you love, or you're worrying about cadmium being an issue, any yellow will do. So first the yellow, and then the orange into the yellow while it's still very wet. If it does dry out in between, you can wait for it to dry completely and then wet it down again. But this is still wet for me, and using the cotton paper, it does stay wet for longer, so I do like this cotton paper that I'm using. It is cold press 100% cotton paper, and I'll put the name on there for you. I'm not sure how to pronounce it. My paper did dry out a little bit though, so I am adding water, starting from the area with no paint yet, and then going down into the area that's still wet with the yellow paint. And then I'm adding some more of that yellow paint. As I wasn't quite happy with the amount that was showing up, I wanted to add just a little bit more. And I'm pulling it all the way down, in part because I want to make sure that it's all the same wetness so that it dries smoothly, wet on wet into each other. And then I'm re-wetting the top of the paper as it wasn't quite as wet as I wanted it to be. I want this to be very, very wet, but without puddles. Very wet, to put in that cobalt blue right at the very top of the paper. And this cobalt blue, I'm bringing it down gently so that it will blend very softly into that white paper that just has water on top of it. That way it will give a very soft, delicate drying line. And this is a good thing to do also if you want to make a mist and you don't want a hard line, is to have water on your paper and then bring the color into that water so that it dries very softly. So now we have that very light blue at the top. I add in just a little more of that cobalt blue to make it a little bit of a deeper color. And it's still wet enough where it is drying very softly with that wet on wet look that I really love. And now I've sped it up, but I am drying it with a hairdryer so you can see the lumpy bumpy paper go back to being nice and smooth and flat when it's dry. And then taking just water, I'm making the cloud shape. So for this cloud shape, I'm going for a look where it's kind of blowing past the scene, where the majority of it would be kind of hidden on the left-hand side. So you're just seeing kind of the tail end of the cloud. Maybe a storm is coming or a storm has passed and you're seeing just the tail end of it in the sunrise. So I'm squiggling just the water out into the sky. Make sure that it's bone dry before you do this. And then I'm adding a magenta rose, and I'm kind of squiggling that out into the water shape of the cloud. And in some areas, I'm going outside of that water shape. But for the majority of it, I'm staying inside that water shape So it's giving me those really soft cloud texture from that paint going into that wet water that's already on the paper. And now I'm adding violet, which is a pretty dark, intense color, but because the paper is already wet, it is thinning out beautifully as I move it across the paper. And I'm just moving my brush in squiggly lines coming out, pulling out that color. And then I'm removing some of the color that has kind of pooled up against the tape line. So you can use your brush as a sponge if you dry it off a little bit on the paper towel and then pick that color back up. And then I'm also picking some of that color back up and using it to form the little bitty bits of clouds out in the distance. And again, those are just little squiggly lines. And most of the little bitty ones are on dry paper, and that's why they have more of a harder line around them. Some of them, especially the ones up closer to the top. And that was it for the cloud. It looks very complex. When you look at the painting, it looks very thought out, but really it's more an experiment on paper. So whatever that paper gives you, I think it's so much fun to just kind of be more free with this, squiggle your paintbrush, play with water, play with the paint, and see what kind of cloud formations you get from it. Don't be too worried about what shapes exactly you're getting, just have some fun with it. And then the next step I'm doing is drawing out the roof blinds. So this is a very simplified version of what I see outside my window. I live in a neighborhood with a lot of homes, and I just wanted to draw a very simple scene where you're looking out above the neighborhood homes. And so I just draw it in the line with pencil. Lots of straight lines and, well, really all just a bunch of straight lines. And a little bit of corners there, a little bit of angle. And then I'm using just water to fill in that roofline area. So I'm making sure that the whole area is very wet. And before you do this, you want to wait for your cloud to dry. So wait for the cloud to dry, then draw in your roofline. Get the entire roofline area wet with water. And then I'm using black paint, but watercolor paint, but you can use purple, you can use blue, any darker color will look nice, I think. You can play around, and if you don't like the color you chose, you can always go on top of that with black if you like the black look. So I'm going over the entire roofline area with black, but slowing down and being very careful at the corners and making sure I'm getting the lines as straight as possible. Now watercolor is textured, watercolor paper is textured. Some watercolor is textured as well, but watercolor paper is textured, so your lines won't ever be super straight really with cold pressed watercolor, unless you have hot pressed watercolor paper that has a smooth finish. With cold pressed, you'll always have a bumpy texture, so don't worry too much about getting straight lines on this. I probably fiddled with it just a little bit too much, but I wanted it to look good for the camera. But I think it looks good even if the lines aren't perfectly straight. I think that just gives it a little bit of character. And I end up going over this initial wash one time to make it just a little bit darker. But if you want it super dark, you can wait till your initial wash dries completely and then go on top of it with a second wash of black or a darker color, and that will give you a very dark roofline area. I wanted mine to be a bit darker than the initial wash, but I didn't want it to be a solid black, like opaque color. I wanted it to have a little bit of transparency still, so I didn't go over it again. I left it so that you can still see some of that white glow of the paper coming through that, and I like that look. But if you want completely dark, very, very dark area with none of that paper glowing through, then just wait for it to dry completely and do 1 or 2 more layers on top. So next I drew in the 3 telephone lines, 1 ruler's width apart, inch and a half wide. I just used the ruler and used that as my guide, and so each telephone line is just 1 ruler's width apart, but you can make them closer together, you can make them farther apart, you can put in more telephone lines, less telephone lines. And then I'm using a micron waterproof pen, and I'm making the lines with the pen going over that pencil line, just so that they're a bit bolder, so that they stand out more. And now you're ready to add your birds. For the birds, I drew them in with pencil first. And for the shape of the birds, it's like a little oval that's fatter on the top and has a little straight line down, or really an angled line down for the tail, and then a little bit of a bump on top for the head that I add when I go over it with the pen. So for now, you just have your oval shape with a little bit of a thicker area on the top. And I put 1 on the bottom, 3 in the center, 1 on the top. And the way I have them positioned, I felt that it balanced the composition with the heavy cloud being on the left-hand side. I have those 2 birds on the right-hand side that are separate from that group of 3 to balance that cloud on the left-hand side. But you can put in the birds however you would like. I'm sure they'll look amazing. Just don't make them too big at first. You can always go bigger. I'm then going over the birds with the Micron waterproof ink pen. And it is the 0.25 millimeter or 1/4 millimeter size tip to it. They come in all different sizes. Some of them are thicker pens that leave a thicker line, and others are barely there, you know, probably the width of a strand of a hair in thickness. So the Micron pens come in a wide range of thicknesses, and this one is the 0.25. So as I'm going over these birds, I'm adding just a little tiny bump to the top of that oval with a thicker part towards the top to represent the head, which my hand is in the way. I should have done filming from an angle at this point, I think, but I'm just adding a tiny little bump to the top of that bird form to give you just the idea of a head. I'm not actually drawing out an entire bird head. I'm just giving that oval that's a little bit thicker towards the top, just a little teeny tiny bump on the top to represent the head. When I'm finished, and after waiting for that ink to dry, so you maybe wait 10 minutes, I use my kneaded eraser and get rid of any extra pencil lines that may be there. And then comes the removing of the tape, which is always a little bit nerve-wracking. So I bought this tape that is called Low Tack Art Tape, and I'm just loving it. It's coming up without tearing any of the paper that I've tried it on. Some of the tapes that I use, I put it on my jeans and pull it up a few times before I put it on my paper, or I do that to the table to kind of lessen the tack a bit. But with this, I don't need to do that at all. I'll try to put a link to it. So now we're done with our beautiful sunrise with the birds on the telephone wire paper. Thank you so much for joining me today. I hope that you've enjoyed this, that you get out there, give it a try. I think you'll really enjoy this painting. It turns out, I've done it a few times in practice, and each time it turned out really cute. Each cloud was different. Each set of birds was different, just depending on what I thought looked balanced. And I've loved it every time. So I hope that you will too. I'll see you next time. Bye.